The 8th graders. So one of the things that you are going to get started with this week is adding color and shading to your still life remix project. The whole reason that I call this a still life remix is because you're drawing still life objects, and I call it a remix because you'll be working with several different techniques in order to add color and shading. So up on my example here, I have the 5 different techniques that you'll be using within your project. What I want you to do today, while I'm recording this video, is start to think about your own composition. You know, what parts do you want to stand out from the rest? So what I've been telling students is if you add color in certain areas and then leave other areas in black and white, that might help draw your eye into the area in color. So think about where you want your focal point to be, where you want the more important parts to be, and think about doing our more colorful techniques in those areas. Colorful would be our fauvism, our abstract, and our realism with color. The other 2 techniques are done in black and white. So when you're looking at your composition, I have to think about, okay, if I want my artist palette to really stand out against the rest, how can I make that pop against the rest? Maybe I'll do that in color and the rest in black and white. So some things to start thinking about. I am going to bring up our slideshow here as well. When you are looking at this example here, I wanted to show you all 5 techniques, and hopefully these arrows and lines aren't too confusing for us. But the first technique you'll be using is realism. So realism is just like it sounds. You're trying to portray that object as realistically as you possibly can. So if I were doing my teal glasses in realistic color, right in this section where you see the red arrow going to, this circle I did in realistic color. So I tried drawing the wood grain of my table and the glasses as realistically as possible with colored pencil. So you will be using realism in one section. So think about when you're looking at your piece, what part will you want to do with realistic color? I might even do the watercolor palette in realistic color this time so that I can really draw attention to that piece. Okay. The second technique that you'll be using is realism, but in black and white only. So if you follow my orange arrow here, that takes you to the realistic black and white portion of my drawing, which is this part of the paintbrush and the palette. You can see I sectioned this one off with a rectangle, and I did one part in just black and white drawing pencil. So we're trying to do the shadows and the highlights as realistically as possible when we are looking at those objects. So realism with color, realism with black and white. You can use these techniques more than once in a drawing. You'll see that I also did realism with black and white down in this region here where the artist palette is. You can also see I used realistic color down here on the watercolor palette as well. So remember, you can use it more than once. So first 2 techniques covered. The third one you will use is fauvism, or contrasting colors. What these artists did in history is they used contrasting colors together within paintings and created just these super beautiful paintings with colors that aren't ordinary. So when we look at the color wheel, for example, contrasting colors are always across from each other on the color wheel. So if you remember that from 7th grade, your complementary color pairs that are across from each other on the wheel are red and green are across from each other, yellow and purple are across from each other, and orange and blue are across from each other. So you can choose one pair and use that within a part of your drawing. I went with orange and blue because those are contrasting complementary colors, and I chose to do that right in this section here. And the cool thing about this one is you'll use that color pair, and whichever color is darker, you'll use that for your shadows, like I did the shadow on the table, and the lighter color, which would be orange, would be used to do the lighter parts of the objects. So it was kind of interesting. It's a different technique and a different way to think about shading. And then also working with some fun colors for this one. If we look back at fauvism and all of the artists during that time period, they were really just using extreme color that contrasted from, or the colors contrasted from each other a lot of times. So you could do yellow and purple otherwise if you didn't want to try blue and orange. Yellow and purple is a really popular one. The purple would be darker, the yellow would be the highlighted areas, and red and green would be your other example. Green would typically be your shaded areas, and red your lighter colors. So you can choose any one of those three for fauvism. I would say traditionally fauvism is done using paint more often, but we'll be using colored pencil for this. So that's our third technique. Our fourth technique that you will be able to use is abstract. So hopefully all of us at this point are aware of what abstract art is. Typically abstract art is the kind of opposite of realism in a way. Abstract art breaks down objects into simple shapes, sometimes to the point where they're not even recognizable. So abstract technique you can kind of use in more of a fun way. You can be very inventive and kind of invent shapes and lines inside your object. So if you follow my green arrow here, my abstract portion of my drawing is the paintbrush here. So this paintbrush doesn't actually have stripes and dots and different patterns on it, but the cool thing about abstract is you can transform these objects however you want to. So you can simplify them into different lines and shapes. You can use abstract color that are super bright and bold and out of the ordinary. So you're doing the opposite of what that object looks like realistically. So you get to have fun and do whatever you want really with abstract. And our fifth one down at the bottom here is pointillism using dots. Pointillism is a technique where artists are really focusing on using a point or a dot in order to create the artwork. With pointillism, we will be using a fine point Sharpie in order to add shadow to your artwork. Now, when you think about adding shadows, you'll add more dots where the shadows are and less dots where the light parts of your object are. So it's really going to require a lot of concentration on the object itself in order to do all of these techniques. Specifically with pointillism, if you look right here, follow the blue line over, you'll see I used pointillism in this circle here, on my glasses up here, and also in part of the palette. This is a really fun one because it's just a different way of doing shading, like I said. So in the areas where you would typically see a darker shadow, you'll just apply more dots in that area, and the areas that are lighter will require less dots or sometimes even none in order to create the highlights. So overall, artists, 5 different techniques. You are going to today look at your artwork and say, where do I want to use each of those 5 techniques so that you are ready to start adding color. Each day this week we'll be focusing on a different technique, and you'll get some work time to add it to your piece. Now, before you add any of these things, you may want to divide your composition up. I used a circle stencil to add some fun circles and also a rectangle stencil or a ruler to add rectangle shapes to my artwork here in order to section off different areas so I could have a little bit more fun with my composition. So if you would like, you could take a stencil and add some large shapes on top of your objects, or the other option would be if you had a ruler or a straight edge. Bring us back to my drawing board here. What you could do is have your ruler going through different parts of your drawing. So for example, I could do one line kind of going straight across here, and I could divide my composition up into different sections and make sure I have at least 5 sections, and I could try a different technique in each one. So that would be another idea that I have seen students do. So after I divide it up, I've got 1 section here, 2 section, a 3rd section. I just need to divide it up 1 more time, or 2 more times. Let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 more time. Maybe I can add another line here. And the cool part about doing it that way is there's no confusion. I can do 1 technique here, 1 technique here, 1 technique here, and then another in this box and another one in this box. So there's multiple ways that you can do this. If you're working from home, you can get creative with some of the things that you might trace if you wanted to trace some shapes onto your artwork. So like for circles, you could trace something like a cup or masking tape, a roll of tape or something like that. For rectangles, you could trace a calculator or something you have at home. For a ruler, if you need a ruler, you can just use one that you may have at home, or you could even use, I tell students to get creative, you could even use the edge of your folder as a straight edge, similar to a ruler as well. So start thinking about that. How are you going to divide your composition up into sections, and where will you use each of the 5 techniques?